This is part 7 and the final sermon in a series that I've entitled No Strings Attached. And we've been looking at different episodes in the life and ministry of Jesus and looking at the way Jesus loves and how his love for sinners like you and me turns everything upside down, inside out, and brings the dead back to life. And so this morning I want to look at John chapter 8. Another familiar passage that even people outside the church are familiar with. One of the things that I wanted to do was go through, during the course of the series, go through very familiar passages and look at them perhaps in a way that's different than the way we had heard them taught or preached in the past. And so John chapter 8 is where I want to spend our time this morning, that familiar passage of the woman caught in adultery, beginning in verse 2, reading down through verse 11, John chapter 8, beginning in verse 2, and reading down through verse 11. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone, with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." And may God illumine our hearts and our minds to the radicality of God's one-way love. The Bible in general, and this passage in particular, teach us that God came to speak two words. Oftentimes when we read the Bible, we think that it's simply a big makeup of a lot of different words, but in essence, what the Bible is the makeup of God speaking two words, a word of bad news and a word of good news. In fact, all of the words in the Bible can be categorized under either bad news or good news. He came, in other words, God came in the person of Jesus to speak a word that exposes us, and then a word that exonerates us, a word of diagnosis, and then a word of deliverance, a word of accusation, and then a word of acquittal. And in this passage, we see Jesus speaking both a word of accusation and a word of acquittal. In these verses, we see specifically that Jesus speaks a word that exposes and a word that exonerates. So in this small, very familiar story, what we have in bite-sized form is, in essence, what God speaks throughout the Bible. A word of accusation followed by a word of acquittal. And so I want to just sort of unpack this passage under two headings. The first heading is God's word that exposes us. And then the second heading is God's word that exonerates us. Now, as we've been looking at throughout this series, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the religious elite in Jesus' day, were always trying to trick Jesus. I mean, we saw that last week even with the Good Samaritan. The lawyer comes to Jesus and says, "How do I inherit eternal life?" And then, following that, the next verse tells us that he didn't ask this question because he was genuinely curious and desiring an answer. He asked this question by way of accusing Jesus, by trying to trick Jesus. And so throughout the Gospels, we see the religious leaders, we see the Pharisees, we see the religious elite trying to trick Jesus. Why? Because his loving attention to sinners drove them nuts. Absolutely drove them crazy. The way Jesus interacted with sinners, the way Jesus interacted with social outcasts, the way Jesus interacted with the people that the Pharisees defined themselves against, absolutely drove the religious leaders nuts. I mean, he was constantly being accused of ignoring tradition and lessening God's law and lowering God's standard. He was always being accused of these things because of the way he interacted with sinners. And so here, he's teaching, and while he's teaching, some religious leaders drag a woman caught in the act of adultery. Okay, it doesn't say that she was simply known as an adulterous woman. It says they brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and they wanted to make a statement in the form of a question. Okay, and this is the statement they wanted to make in the form of a question. Verse 4, verse 5, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" See what they're up to here, okay? They are trying to show that Jesus ignores tradition, that Jesus has virtually no respect for the Old Testament, which was the Bible at that time, that they're trying to pit Jesus against Moses. They're trying to show that Jesus is being inconsistent, not consistent with what the Old Testament reveals. They're trying to trick him. And so their motivation, if you read on verse 6, their motivation for asking this question is exposed. They weren't really looking for an answer. They were making an accusation against Jesus. Well, then Jesus does something strange, okay? I mean, he does something weird. In fact, this passage doesn't even explain all that he does here, except just to state that he bends down and he writes something with his finger. It doesn't tell us what he wrote. It just says he bends down and in the dust of the ground on the street, he writes something with his finger. And then he says, after he writes the first time, he says, "Let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone." Now I had to stop and think about that and go, okay, this has been a passage that has confused people for a long time because it doesn't tell us what he wrote. I mean, it doesn't tell us what he said. It tells us the way that the religious leaders responded to what he said. So apparently whatever he wrote in the ground was clear to them, but it doesn't tell us here what he wrote in the ground. And so I started thinking about other places in the Bible where God writes with his finger. What are some other places in the Bible where God writes something with his finger? And there are two places that the Bible speaks of specifically where God writes something down with his finger. The first, as you well know, is with Moses in the Ten Commandments. That God comes down and he writes something down with his finger. He writes down the law. He writes down on 2 tablets the law that he gives through Moses to the people of Israel. That's the first place that we find in the Bible where God writes with his law. The second place, and this is a familiar story to many of you, I'm sure, is in Daniel chapter 5. If you want to go there, Daniel chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. King Belshazzar, it says, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Big party, okay? The scene is a party. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, so that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay, so there's this huge party taking place, and Belshazzar asks that the cups that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem after Babylon had captured and seized all of the goods in Jerusalem, be brought to the party so that they can kind of flaunt their victory and thumb their nose at the God of Israel. Okay, so this is all going on. This big wingding is going on. And then verse 5 says, while this is going on, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. This is strange now, okay? This would kind of freak you out. It would probably make you wonder whether or not you had too much to drink. Does anyone else see the hand writing on the wall? Okay. Now, skip down to verse 24. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: many, many, tekel, and parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So, 2 places in the Bible. 10 Commandments, God writes with his finger and gives the law. Here, God comes down and writes with his finger and essentially says, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. In both places where God comes down and writes with his finger, he writes law. He writes a word of accusation. He writes down his impeccable, perfect standard. And here to Belshazzar, he says, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. So I take those 2 episodes in the Old Testament where God comes down and writes with his finger, and I fast forward to our passage today and go, what in the world could Jesus be writing? I mean, the only other 2 places in the Bible where God writes with his finger, he writes law. And what we know here is that Jesus writes something with his finger, and as a result, the religious leaders walk away. They're scattered, okay? So I go back and I say, okay, what in the world could Jesus have written? What was he writing? Now, we can't say for sure what Jesus wrote, but it's clear that whatever he wrote exposed the sinfulness of those who accuse the woman. So whatever he wrote, okay, caused these men to go, whoops, whatever he wrote. In other words, whatever he wrote in some way, shape, or form communicated God's perfect, holy standard. He could have written, you have been found, you weighed in the balances and found wanting. One of the things that I've thought he could have written is that he wrote, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery. Remember the Sermon on the Mount? Where Jesus, in essence, explains the law because the religious leaders thought they were keeping the law just fine and that God was impressed with their efforts. And Jesus says the law's much bigger and extends to much deeper places than you guys think. I mean, you've heard it said, that if you don't commit adultery, you're fine. But I tell you that if you have ever looked on a woman lustfully, you have committed adultery with her in your heart. In other words, Jesus shows in the Sermon on the Mount that God's perfect standard extends beyond simply what we do on the outside to what's going on inside, and that when we compare ourselves to the perfect, holy standard of God, every single one of us are weighed in the balances and found wanting. Because one thing that was very clear in this passage, John chapter 8, is that these Pharisees thought that they were keeping God's law and she wasn't. They thought that they were better than her. They were clean, she was dirty. They thought they were better. And so Jesus, whatever he writes, Jesus levels the playing field and shows you actually think you're better than her, you're no better than she is. Just because you may have not been caught in the act of adultery, none of you can tell me that you've never, ever had a lustful thought. And if you have, then you're just as guilty before God as she is. So whatever he wrote caused them to scatter, caused them to walk away. It exposed their sinfulness. It was a word of accusation that showed them that they were no better than she was. I mean, what's obvious here is that they have a much higher view of themselves than they do the adulterous woman. And we make this mistake all the time. You know, I mean, one of the ways that we live with ourselves, one of the ways that we survive is by concluding that at some level there are people who are worse than us. This is what the law does. The law leads to comparison. If we live our life by law, we will always be able to identify someone who's not doing it as good as we're doing it. Always. You know, we divide in our hearts and our minds, we divide people into classes. There are the clean, there are the dirty. There are the good, there are the bad. There are law keepers and there are law breakers. And part of the way we try to secure our own identity is by locating ourselves in whatever category we think is above and beyond the category beneath us. There will always be people above us, but we can handle that as long as we know that there are people beneath us. You know, it's amazing to me. I've said this before, but the world is not impressed with our goodness. They're not. Okay? There are plenty of people throughout history who don't know Jesus, who have been more generous than you, who on the outside have been kinder to their enemies than you. I mean, the world is not impressed with our goodness. It is not our freedom. It's not our freedom that causes the world to stumble. It's our fakeness. So the world doesn't need to see our competence and our cleanness. The world needs to hear our confession that we too are wretches in desperate need of God's grace. Okay, and so we do this, they did that, and Jesus here shows them that far from what they had concluded, far from what they had thought, he shows here that God came for the bad people. He didn't come for the good people, he came for the bad people, and that when measured against God's perfect holiness, we're all bad. Okay, I mean, that's what he says. I mean, we looked at a couple weeks ago when Jesus said, I didn't come for the righteous, I came for the unrighteous. And he wasn't saying that there are two classes of people. There are those who don't need me and those who do. There are the righteous and there are the unrighteous. He's saying, I didn't come for you who think you can make it on your own. I didn't come for those who, because they think they're good and clean before God, they don't need me. I came for those who are desperate. I came for those who are acutely aware of their own sin. I came for those who recognize that without me, they have no hope in this world or the next. Those are the ones who will respond to what I have to say. Well, here again, Jesus shows, you guys think that God is impressed with your goodness and that he came for the clean. I'm saying that God is not impressed with your goodness, that all of your righteousness is as filthy rags before a holy God, and that God came not for the good people, God came for the bad people, and that all of us are bad when you compare us to God's holy standard, which is why I've said before, God does not grade on a curve, okay? God does not give you an A for effort. That's not the way God operates. If that was the way God operated, then Jesus is irrelevant. Then he came for nothing, okay? We're not accepted and approved by God based on our improvement. We are accepted and approved by God based on Christ's imputation. So, as I've said before, while we need Jesus as friend, while we need Jesus as mediator, while we need Jesus as our wonderful counselor, we need him first and foremost as our substitute. That's what we need. Someone to come and stand in the gap to do for us what we could never do for ourselves, which is precisely what he accomplished with his life, in his death, and at his resurrection. So, I'm thinking about this yesterday and going, what is it that prevents me from reveling in God's goodness, from believing in God's goodness? What is it? And I realize that the first step to enjoying God's goodness is admitting our badness. I mean, really, and you find this a lot inside the church. People who have a real problem when you talk about unconditional love or the radical nature of God's grace. And of course, the great fear is if you talk about this, then people will go off the deep end. I'm going to address that in a minute. But one of the primary reasons, and most people don't know this about themselves, one of the primary reasons they qualify God's goodness, or they footnote God's goodness, or they add lots of buts and breaks when the Bible talks about God's goodness, they want to qualify it. The reason we do that is because the harder thing is to finally admit our badness. If we really, really, really knew how bad we were at the core, we would revel in God's goodness and spend the rest of our lives celebrating it. Like teenage girls, okay? We would celebrate it. We would recognize that it's our only lifeline. It's our only hope, that without it, we would be in big, big trouble. So that's the first step. That's why God's first word is a word of accusation. He has to break us down. Martin Luther said, I tweeted it yesterday. It's this remarkable quote about his own self-righteousness, and what he needs is an axe to cut down his own self-righteousness, and the law is God's axe. Okay, it's a revelation of God's perfect, holy standard that requires not our progress, but Christ's perfection. And so here Jesus, whatever he writes, and I like to think that he wrote, I can say with confidence that he wrote law because they scattered. And the other two places in the Bible where God wrote, he wrote law. Okay, so I can say that with confidence. We can't say specifically what he wrote, but I like to think that it was a reiteration of his Sermon on the Mount, where he says, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in their heart. Are any of you guys guilty of that? Any? And they slowly scatter, okay? They slowly walk away. When you think about it, and this is true for me, the thing that gets in the way of our love for God is not so much our unrighteous badness, but more so our self-righteous goodness. When we think we're beyond God's help. We've finally grown, we're mature Christians. People sometimes say, well, Paul himself says, I can't give you solid meat, I have to continue giving you milk. And they assume that, milk is sort of the ABCs of the Christian faith, John 3:16, and then, the meat is Romans, systematic theology, robust doctrine. And because you don't get this, because you're dumb and you're not good theologians, I have to keep going back to John 3:16 because you just simply aren't in a position where you can get Romans. That's not what Paul means. What Paul means when he says, I can't give you solid meat, I have to keep giving you milk, what he means there is, listen, you still don't get the gospel. The meat of God's word to us is the depth and the radicality of the gospel. As I've said before, God does not, when he saves us, move us beyond the gospel, but deeper into it. That's the meat. That's the meat of it. And so here, the thing that gets in my way of understanding or reveling in the amazing grace of God is not so much my unrighteous badness. In fact, it's when I'm bad and I'm aware of my badness that I become more deeply aware of God's grace. Okay, which is why Steve Brown said when he was here at Liberate, if you were here back in February, he said, your greatest enemy is your goodness when you know it. And your greatest gift is your sin when you know it. Why would he say something like that? He says something like that because when God's law comes and reveals our own sinfulness, it's then that we learn to trust in him and him alone, and we recognize that what we bring to the table just won't cut it. And so here Jesus is doing that. He writes the law, and it's a word that exposes him. You know the biggest problem facing the church today, in my opinion? And if you look out at our very immoral culture, you might ask a lot of Christians, what's the biggest problem facing the church today? And they would say, we've lowered God's standard. Or we don't, I'll tell you what it is. We talk so much about God's love and we talk so much about God's grace that we're not taking the holiness of God's standard seriously. Okay, we're not taking it seriously. The biggest problem facing the church today is cheap grace, they would say. Okay, just look at the world around us. Look at look at the divorce rate. Look at the way the world is falling apart. Look at the rampant immorality. This is the biggest problem facing the church today. It's cheap grace. We need to get back to proclaiming the standard of God. All right? That's the biggest problem facing the church today, cheap grace. Let me tell you, that's not the biggest problem. Okay, the biggest problem facing the church today is not cheap grace, but cheap law. This idea that God accepts anything less than the perfect righteousness of Jesus. Okay, that's the biggest problem facing the church today, because some think that those who talk about grace have a low view of God's law. The fact is, it's just the opposite. Those who revel in grace have a high view of the law, because they realize that the bar is so high that they're forced to say, I can't do it. Unless help comes, I'm ruined. Cheap law is not the problem. We need to thunder the height of God's law in such a way that people feel crushed and run to Jesus. Okay, that's the problem. It's not cheap grace. Okay, I don't even like that phrase. And Steve Brown says, if it wasn't cheap, I couldn't afford it, okay? First of all, it's costly grace, and the cost was laid on the shoulders of Jesus so that it could come our way for free. It's not cheap, it's free to you and me. Costly to God, free for us. But the problem is not cheap grace, it's cheap law. And this is what happens here. Jesus' word of law exposes the religious leaders, and one by one, like the rich young ruler, they walk away. They start to disperse. And notice what it says. Who were the first people to walk away? It was the older people. I read that a couple times and I said, all right, what's going on there? And I started thinking about my life. I think about when God first saved me at 21 years old. I had remarkably high expectations for where I would be when I hit 40. I would basically be sinless by the time I'm 40. If I just do more and try harder, I will be virtually sinless by the time I'm 40. And I thought that's what Christian growth was all about. Growing stronger and stronger and more competent, so that as I grow, I need Jesus less and less, because now I can stand on my own 2 feet. That's the way most people think about Christian growth. When they think about sanctification, they think sanctification is I'm becoming stronger and stronger and more competent. And they might not say this, but what's implied is I'm getting to the point where I need Jesus less now than I did at the very beginning when God first saved me. As if Christian growth is progress beyond our need for Jesus. Well, you turn 40, like I did last summer, and you realize I'm not nearly as far along as I thought I would be. In fact, in some ways I've gotten worse, or at the very least, I'm more aware now of the depth of my sin and my faults and my failures. I'm more aware now of my fears than I was at 21 years old. I was much more idealistic at 21, much more realistic at 40. And so, I've said this to you guys before. This was me at 21. I'm going to change the world. Change the world. And this is me at 40. I can't change myself. I can't change my wife. I can't change my kids. I can't change the church. God help me. Okay, that's 40. Now, when we take that perspective into those who walked away first, I go, whatever Jesus wrote, the older people walked away first. Whatever he wrote was easier, in a sense, for them to swallow than the young people. I can just imagine the scene. Sort of the young religious leaders standing there wanting to dig in their heels and looking around at the older people who are starting to walk away. They're like, okay, uncle. And walking away, and the young guy's going, come on, stand your ground. We can take this guy. After all, we're young and we're energetic. We're Pharisees. We know the law. God loves us. He's impressed by us. Come on, where are you going? I mean, I run into this all the time. Just young, idealistic Christians who have a much higher view of themselves and what they can accomplish than older saints. I mean, as you get older, you become increasingly realistic. You've lived enough life. You've failed enough times. You have fallen on your face enough. You've suffered enough. There have been enough things that have happened in your life that you have been unable to control and manipulate. As you get older, you become increasingly aware of how weak and incompetent you are. And so as a result, you become more realistic. Even as you get older, your body starts shutting down. Lots of your idealism has crashed and burned. You're much more realistic. And to some people, that might sound so depressing. Well, we're just giving up and giving in. No, you're not. You're recognizing reality. I'm not God. And God alone can do for me what I could never do for myself. That's Christian growth. That's what Paul said. That's the way Paul described Christian growth. I'm the worst guy that I know. He said that at the end of his life. He just said, I'm the least of all the saints. I'm the chief of sinners. Romans 7's a phenomenal place to go if you want to understand what Paul means, not what you and I mean, when it comes to Christian growth. Christian growth is always downward. It's always descending into reality, recognizing just how weak and frail and incompetent I am. And as I come to terms with that, I become increasingly aware of how strong and competent Jesus is for me. Okay? And so here I look at this passage and I go, all right, the older people walked away first. They're sort of, and I'm thinking the younger people are like, where are you going? Let's take this guy. And the older people are like, listen, man, I was in your spot at one point. And I've just been leveled again. And so here we have, you live long enough and you begin to realize you're not as strong and capable as you once thought you were. And so God's first word, which is law, is intended to expose us and show us that none of us are as good as we think we are. None of us are guilt-free. God speaks a word of law and it causes us to see our nakedness. It causes us to recognize our weakness. It exposes us for who we really are. That's what God's law does. But it's God's second word, the gospel, which exonerates us and sets us free. Jesus turns his attention away from the Pharisees and he turns his attention to this woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. After all the religious leaders walk away defeated by God's law, Jesus speaks a word of deliverance to this adulterous woman. He says, beginning in verse 10, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? They dragged you here. They dragged you here." My imagination starts wondering, did the Pharisees plan this? Were they watching her for a while so that they could be at the right place at the right time and catch her in the act? How shameful would that be? Think about the shame. Think about the guilt and shame this woman must have felt. We don't know anything about this woman. We don't know her background. We don't know what kind of relationship she had with, her mother or her father. We know nothing about her. We just know that she was caught in the act of adultery. And the shame of a bunch of religious leaders barging in while you're in the act and taking you out, dragging you out into a public place and throwing you before this guy who calls himself the Messiah and basically accusing this guy in the form of a question and saying, what should we do with her? The law tells us to do this. What do you say? No care or concern for this woman at all. There was no care or concern. They weren't trying to help her. They weren't trying to see what they could do. They weren't trying to understand her story and see if there was a way they might be able to minister to her. These are religious leaders, the pastors of the day. And this is what they do to a woman caught in adultery? They plan and they scheme behind closed doors. And then they barge in, embarrass her, shame her, guilt her, drag her into a public place. For what? Because they're trying to trick Jesus. Okay? This is what's going on. Now, lest you and I go, what jerks! Can't believe these people. We do this every day, okay? Every word of gossip, every foul thought, every vengeful feeling, every ounce of bitterness, all of that stuff is our way of elevating ourselves above someone else, accusing someone else so that we can exonerate ourselves. Okay, this is what's going on. I mean, this is what's going on. These people, and so they drag her out, and Jesus writes a word of law. They scatter, and he looks at this woman. I can only imagine the scene. Okay, this is not some private behind the building stuff. This is in a public place, a holy place. And he looks at this woman. I mean, Jesus just doesn't seem to care about approval points with the public. He really doesn't. I mean, you know how many brownie points Jesus lost from the time his ministry became public because of the people he associated with and the things that he said? I mean, he didn't care about the power brokers. Everybody who was rich ran away from him. I mean, they just, the self-made people didn't like what he had to say because he kept calling people desperate. And they didn't like to think of themselves as desperate. They like to think of themselves as conquerors and victorious and strong and self-made men and women and that sort of thing. I mean, you think about all of the people that we find ourselves attracted to, for the most part, the rich and the famous and the powerful and the influential and all those things. These are the people who couldn't stand Jesus. Jesus hung out with people that, just to state it simply, if you and I hung out with, people would start questioning our salvation. They did question Jesus' salvation. I mean, they literally said, you can't be God. God doesn't hang out with riffraff. We know that. God's holy. And, God doesn't hang out with these people. God hangs out with people like us. So by virtue of the fact that you're hanging out with them and not us proves that you must not be the Christ. So you picture the scene. Jesus loses brownie points, I'm sure, again, because the crowd is watching. The Pharisees leave. The crowd is watching and going, they had a point. I mean, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses is pretty clear. What's going on here? And notice what Jesus says. Where are they? Where are they? Is there no one left to condemn you? And she just shakes her head, probably with tears streaming down her face. And he says, well, then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. This is the deal. God's law is for those who think they're good. God's gospel is for those who know that they're bad. God uses his law to crush hard hearts, and he uses his gospel to cure broken hearts. Now, the order of Jesus' wording here is crucial. He doesn't say, if you go and sin no more, then neither will I condemn you. Okay, that's the default mode of your heart and mind as we think about God. We have to get clean. We don't say these kinds of things. I have to get clean in order for God to love me. We don't say that, but that's where our heart tends to drift. There are certain things I have to do to get God's love and favor. I have to clean up my act before I can show up before a holy God. I have to clothe myself in cleanliness before God will love me, before God will accept me, before God will approve of me. This is what the mistake that most people make when it comes to God. They think obedience precedes acceptance. Non-Christian people make that mistake. Christian people make that mistake. God will love me if I'm good. God will love me if I do what is right. God will love me if I obey. But Jesus here reverses the order and shows that forgiveness precedes faithfulness. A life of faithfulness does not produce forgiveness. Forgiveness precedes faithfulness. The order is absolutely crucial. This is precisely what the religious leaders were afraid of. This is what they didn't like about Jesus. He distributed forgiveness so promiscuously. He was just so generous and liberal with his with his distribution of forgiveness. And so their biggest problem was you can't distribute forgiveness full and free or people will get out of control. And the underlying fear there is that unconditional grace will lead to licentious living. Okay? I mean, that is wherever I go and whoever I talk to, Christian leader or otherwise, down deep, this is their fear. You can't preach this stuff. I mean, if you preach this stuff, people will go off the deep end. And I say, maybe. It's possible that some will. I mean, Jesus healed 10 lepers. Only one came back. And we look at the 9 and say, grace didn't work. Jesus looks at the 1 and says, yes, it does. Okay? So I say, possibly, but what is it that you think actually produces change? What changes a human heart? What produces a life of fruitfulness? What produces a life of obedience? What produces a life of love and service to your neighbor? What produces that kind of thing? Is it telling people that they're failing and using guilt and fear? Is that what does it? If you're a parent and you think that works, wait till your kid goes off to college, okay? I'm telling you, that's not the way human beings are wired. The law is good because it exposes us and it shows us what godliness looks like and it illumines the path of obedience, but it can't change a heart and make it obedient. It can't produce fruit. The underlying fear is that unconditional grace will lead to licentiousness, so we dare not talk about unconditional grace. We have to talk about something else, or we have to qualify it. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the great preacher from Westminster Chapel in London, said, this is such a prophetic statement, and he wrote this in the 1960s, okay? The state of the church can be explained by the fact that for nearly 100 years we've been preaching morality and not the gospel. Is that unbelievable? What a prophetic word. The state of the church can be explained, he writes, by the fact that for nearly 100 years we've been preaching morality and not the gospel. And so I've thought oftentimes as I interact with, different people that while attacks on morality will always come from the irreligious, you can't look at our world today, our culture today, and not see rampant attacks on morality, okay? Attacks on morality will always come from the irreligious, but attacks on grace will always come from the religious. We see that here. Why? Why do attacks on grace come from inside the church? We just continually bite the hand that feeds us. It's like the grace that has saved us and continues on a moment by moment to sustain us, we question, we doubt, we qualify, we footnote, we put in parentheses. I grew up going to church and heard a lot more about what grace wasn't than what it was. And the reason was because there was this underlying fear that if we talk about grace and forgiveness and God's love too much, people are going to go off the deep end. And, the goal of the Christian life is to keep people from having premarital sex. That's the goal, okay? It's the goal. That's the goal. It's every parent's goal for their kids. What's Christianity? I don't know, but as long as it keeps my child from having premarital sex, it works, okay? Or taking drugs, or doing something stupid, or getting drunk, or going to jail. That's the goal. And gosh, since that's the goal, we better not talk about love and forgiveness and grace too much because God forbid these teenagers will walk out of here and think to themselves, well, if God's forgiveness is true, now I can go sleep with my boyfriend or girlfriend. And it's not wrong, okay? That's the fear. This is the deal. Attacks on grace will always come from the religious because somewhere along the way we've come to believe that this whole thing is about behavioral modification and grace just doesn't possess the teeth to scare us into changing. That's what we've concluded. But I have never, ever once met one person who is so captured by God's grace and forgiveness that they say, woo-hoo-hoo-hoo, now I can go do whatever I want. To anyone who goes, woo-hoo-hoo-hoo, now I can go do whatever I want, okay? To anyone who says that doesn't indicate that they get grace so much that they now feel like they can do whatever they want. What that shows is that they get grace too little. Because what actually happens when a human heart is captured and mugged by God's grace is we say, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. I mean, that happens horizontally. I mean, you think about the people that you love the most and the people that you desire to serve the most, the people that you would take a bullet for. Who is it? It's the person who took a bullet for you once. It's the person who loved you in a moment when you were unlovable. It's the person who, when everybody else was accusing you, said, I'm with you. I mean, those are the people you take a bullet for. I mean, you know that's true horizontally. I mean, you know that those moments in your life, those snapshots in your life when you were captured and changed and transformed, when your eyes were open and the lights went on, those are the moments not when someone was hitting you over the head. Those were the moments when someone gave you what you didn't deserve. Someone stood by your side. You know, in 2009, we went through a really, really rough transition here at the church as a result of the merger between the church that I had planted and Coral Ridge. And I mean, I'm telling you, there are men in this church and there are women in this church who, if they were to call on me for anything, I would drop everything that I was doing to go and be by their side and to help and to serve and take a bullet for. Why? Because during that time, they took bullets for me. That's what grace does. That's what it does. People who really get it down deep don't go, this is great, now I'm going to do whatever I want. It's awesome. What a great deal. People who really, really, really get it down deep are people who say, I want to love God and love my neighbor as a result of the love and grace that I've been shown. Grace produces change. It's God's final word that produces change. I mean, grace creates a longing for good, not a lust for bad, okay? And yet, grace promises that when we are bad, which we are, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. It's a full covering. And so this idea that, you know, grace just doesn't possess the power to cause people to change, and that's really the goal, to modify behavior. It's a bad strategy. Love and forgiveness is what produces heart change. And so the ordering of Jesus' words here is crucial. Neither do I condemn you, now go and sin no more. If Jesus said, you go and sin no more, then come back to me in 30 days. I'm God, so I see everything you're doing, so I'll know if you're telling me the truth or not, okay? You go and sin no more, and then you come back to me, and I'll let you know whether or not I condemn you. You got 30-day grace period from me. Go do your best, okay? Go out there. Win it, you know? One for the Gipper. Do it. Go do it. And if you come back clean, then neither will I condemn you. He doesn't say that. She would never come back. But when he speaks a word of acquittal, when he speaks a word of forgiveness, when he speaks a no condemnation word and says, I don't condemn you, now go sin no more. What's the one thing that would prevent this woman from going and sleeping around more? You think the Pharisees? I mean, gosh, all she would have had, I think about this with our children all the time. I'm like, you know, if all we use is law, their heart won't be changed, and their heart won't be changed, and they'll just find sneaky ways to get around what we say. You know, it's true. And so I'm thinking, okay, if all this woman received was the accusation of the Pharisees, that wouldn't have changed her heart and said, oh, I really want to stop living this way, it's enslaving. She would have just figured out, where are the Pharisees, you know, so that I can go to places where they're not near. I mean, how do I prevent them from tailing me and watching me? She would have just become more sneaky. But when Jesus says, I don't condemn you, I forgive you, I love you, that would be this woman's only hope for getting up and going, I'm turning my back on the life that I had lived. I mean, I mentioned a couple weeks ago, that was what happened with Jean Valjean in Les Mis. You know, the priest speaks a word of unconditional forgiveness, and it changed his life forever. That's the only thing that can change your life. That's the only thing that can change my life too. So grace is not the obstacle to change, it is its catalyst. I mean, fear and guilt don't cause people to do more and try harder. It makes them give up. I mean, legalism produces lawlessness 10 times out of 10. Grace doesn't produce lawlessness, legalism does. Because you try and try and try and try and try, and eventually you quit because you crash and burn. So as I said a couple weeks ago when we looked at Zacchaeus, gratitude, generosity, honesty, compassion, acts of mercy, self-sacrifice, all of those things spring unsummoned from a forgiven heart. Let me just read this story in closing. My friend John wrote a book entitled Grace and Addiction, and he's an alcoholic and saved, been sober now for a number of years. But he tells this story toward the end of his book about an old-timer. You know, they don't, in AA, they don't announce your last name. So this guy's name is simply Dick A. His last name began with A. And John tells this story of this old guy named Dick A, whose first encounter with grace changed him. Okay, listen to this story. So I walked up to the payphone and dialed the number for AA. I started crying, saying, "I'm an alcoholic." Instead of rejecting me, the woman on the phone said, "Just a minute, you wait right there." And she sent out a guy to get me named Ed. I actually resisted listening to him for a while because I thought he wasn't hip like me. I knew that I was just down on my luck. Ed, on the other hand, looked like he had never had any luck at all. But then I saw his eyes. He did what it talks about in the Big Book, which is the book for Alcoholics Anonymous. He did what it talks about in the Big Book. He relived the horrors of his past with me. He told me about himself, and he did something that I learned a great lesson from. He asked me about me. He said, "What do you do?" And I started crying. I said, "I think I'm an alcoholic." But he cut me off and said, "No, what did you do for a living before drinking got the better of you?" And I told him about my writing. He actually recognized some of the things I'd written, and he said, "That's great stuff. You're very talented. God must really have something in mind for you." Then I just broke down and started crying, because no one had said anything kind or hopeful to me in years. And if he hadn't done that, I would not be here sober today. He had read the Big Book, and he understood that we don't get anyone into recovery by being tough on them, but we get people here by unconditional love. They're already hurt, and they've already been through enough hell. We don't need to add to it. We need to let them know that there's a place where there's hope, and that's what Ed did for me. After we talked for a little while, Ed put me into his Pinto. Remember those? Ed put me into his Pinto to get me some water to drink so that he could help me taper off the booze because I was now starting to vibrate. He realized that I was going into convulsions because he had worked with wet drunks before. And he looked at me and said, "Are you going to be okay? I'm going to stop over here just for 1 minute to get some money so we can get you on track." And he got out of his car to use an ATM. It was the first ATM machine I'd ever seen. They were pretty new in 1977. It was a hot day, June the 8th, 1977 in Atlanta. So he goes up to the machine to get his $20 or whatever, and before he can get back to the car, I couldn't get the door open because my hands were rattling so much, and I had thrown up all down the inside of his brand new Pinto. And the only thing he did when he opened the door and saw what had happened was put his arm around me. He said, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." If he had been critical of me, I would not be here tonight. I read that. I remember when that story was first read to me, I thought, how in the world could we ever conclude that the primary agent of change is not grace and forgiveness? It's true for you. It's true for him. I mean, the reason that Jesus is able to save us from our guilt and sin is because he became guilty and sinful for us. That's what Paul says. I mean, transformation happens by virtue of association. And Jesus became sin. He who knew no sin became sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. It is grace and grace alone that changes human hearts and sets them free. We see that here. We know it in our own life. Thank God that it's true.